She sold her wedding ring after 55 years just to buy bread for her grandkids. But when that quiet sacrifice reached Keanu Reeves, everything changed. What started with one desperate act would uncover a buried message, ignite a citywide transformation, and lead to a final twist no one, not even Keanu, could have seen coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The bell above the door jingled as Irene Martinez stepped into Leon's pawn and loan. The air inside was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the summer heat pressing against the Portland sidewalks. Her hands trembled slightly as she unzipped her handbag. After 55 years, she was doing something she had never imagined, removing the gold wedding ring her husband Luis had placed on her finger the day they said, "I do." Mr. Leon, the pawn shop owner, looked up from his counter. He was in his 60s, with reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck. His face softened when he recognized her. "Bien," he said gently. "What brings you in today?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers hesitated at the edge of the zipper, as if her body were giving her one last chance to turn around and walk out. But the image of her granddaughter Lily, eating the last piece of bread yesterday morning, tightened something in her chest. She couldn't wait any longer. She reached into her purse, pulled out the small velvet pouch and set it on the glass counter. And Smith Leon opened it slowly. Inside was a worn gold band, simple and elegant, with 3 small diamonds. The center stone was slightly larger than the other 2. Mr. Leon lifted it with practiced care and examined it under his look. "I never thought I'd see this off your hand," he said quietly. "Neither did I." Irene's voice was a whisper. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded. "It's 14 karat, solid. Diamonds are modest but clear." He scribbled something on a slip of paper, tapped a few keys on his ancient register, and looked up. "I can give you 900? Irene nodded. It wasn't enough. Not really. But it would buy food, and maybe keep the lights on a little longer. Mr. Leon counted out the bills and placed them in a plain white envelope. "I'll hold the ring for 2 weeks before I put it out, just in case you—" "I won't be back," she said, gently but firmly. He hesitated. "You want a receipt?" "No, just the envelope." He handed it over, and Irene tucked it deep into her handbag, zipping it shut with trembling fingers. She didn't look back at the ring. Outside, the air felt hotter, heavier. Traffic passed in lazy waves, the sky a dull gray that promised no relief. Irene walked to the bus stop, her purse clutched close. At the corner store, she bought a loaf of bread, peanut butter, and powdered milk. She paused in the candy aisle for a moment, looking at the little chocolate bars that Lily and Mateo loved. Her hand hovered, then withdrew. The money had to last. Her knees ached as she stepped back into the sunlight. She made it to the bus stop just as her old flip phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out, squinting at the cracked screen. News alert. Actor Keanu Reeves in Portland for surprise charity event. Sources say he's visiting several community sites. She smiled faintly, her thumb tracing the edge of the phone. Her husband Luis had loved his movies. The Lake House, Speed. Always said Keanu seemed like one of the good ones. She tucked the phone away and boarded the bus. Not for the first time, she whispered an apology to Luis under her breath. The bus ride home was quiet, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of conversation between other passengers. Irene sat by the window, her handbag on her lap, one hand resting lightly over it. The envelope inside felt heavier than it should have, as if the money it carried came not just from a ring, but from a lifetime of memory. Luis had given her that ring on a windy April afternoon, with shaking hands and a heart so big it could barely fit in his chest. He worked 2 jobs back then, one at the cannery and one cleaning offices at night. He had saved for a year to buy it. She still remembered the tiny bakery where he proposed, slipping the ring on her hand with flour-dusted fingers and calling her his miracle. Now the miracle was gone. And so was the ring. When she stepped off the bus and onto the cracked pavement of Northeast 115th Avenue, she adjusted the grocery bag and walked the last 2 blocks to the small duplex she shared with her daughter's family. The paint on the outside was peeling, and the porch light hadn't worked in months. Inside, the smell of baby wipes and reheated macaroni filled the air. Camila looked up from the couch, her face flushed and tired. Baby Rosie was cradled in one arm, crying softly. "I mean, thank God, Rosie hasn't stopped since you left." "I've got her," Irene said gently, dropping the bag on the kitchen counter and taking the baby into her arms. Rosie quieted almost instantly, pressing her face into her grandmother's shoulder. "I got bread and peanut butter," Irene said. "Not much, but enough for lunch. I'll figure out dinner later." Camila nodded. "I called about 3 jobs this morning. No one's hiring, or they want weekend shifts. Danny's still on bed rest. He can't be alone with the kids." "How is he?" "Sleeping. The new meds help some, but he hates feeling useless." "He's not useless," Irene said. Camila gave her a long look. "You didn't go to the garden today, did you?" "No," Irene replied, too quickly. "Too hot." Camila narrowed her eyes. "Your hand, Mom. Where's your ring?" Irene felt the blood rush to her face. She turned away, adjusting Rosie in her arms. "Must have slipped off in the backyard yesterday. I was pulling weeds." "You never take that ring off." "It's just a ring," Irene said, more sharply than she meant to. Camila didn't push further, but her silence filled the room. Mateo and Lily came in from the small back patio, both barefoot and hungry. Irene put Rosie in her playpen and started making sandwiches. She kept her hand turned away, hiding the bare spot. At night, after the kids were bathed and tucked in, Irene sat alone at the tiny kitchen table. The envelope of money was hidden in her old cookie tin behind the flour. She rubbed her ring finger absent-mindedly, feeling the phantom band. Her eyes drifted to the family photo on the wall. Louis, beaming, surrounded by their children and grandchildren at his 70th birthday. She missed him more than ever. "I did what I had to," she whispered to the photo. "Please understand." The next morning, Irene rose early. The sun was barely up, but the house was already warm. Portland's summers had become harsher in recent years, and their old air conditioner couldn't keep up. She tiptoed around the sleeping children and made herself a small cup of instant coffee. She stood by the window, watching the garbage truck rattle past, and sipped in silence. The ring finger on her left hand felt oddly cold. She kept brushing it against her thumb, still expecting to feel the smooth band. Camila joined her a few minutes later, rubbing her eyes and adjusting the worn robe that barely covered her growing belly. Irene hadn't asked yet, but she knew. A 4th child was on the way. That's why Camila had looked extra tired lately. That's why she hadn't said a word about it, ashamed, probably, of how complicated things already were. "You okay, Mom?" "I'm fine," Irene said. "Just thinking." They made breakfast together in quiet rhythm. Scrambled eggs, toast, a few apples that were beginning to soften. Mateo helped set the table, and Lily chased Rosie around the living room until she was breathless with laughter. By the time the food was plated, the news was already on in the background. Camila muted it, as usual, but Irene caught the scrolling headline before the volume disappeared. "Keanu Reeves spotted in Portland. Local charity tour begins today." Her eyes lingered on the screen. A photo showed him in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, shaking hands at a shelter downtown. Luis would have liked that. Said Keanu always seemed like the kind of man who showed up without cameras, without ego. After breakfast, Camila headed out to apply for another job, taking Lily with her. Mateo had a summer reading program at the library. That left Irene home with Rosie and Danny, who hadn't left the bed in days. She laid Rosie down for a nap, then checked on Danny. He was awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it clicked slowly above him. "How's the pain?" she asked. He shrugged. "It's better than yesterday. Still feels like someone drove a spike through my spine. I'll bring you some water." As she turned to leave the room, he called out softly, "I know you didn't lose the ring, Irene." She froze. "You were never the lying type," he said, his voice hoarse. "But Camila's too tired to see it. And the kids don't notice." "I do." She turned back. "It's none of your business." "It is," Danny said gently, "because I'm the reason you did it. And I hate that." Irene sat on the edge of the bed. "I did it for this family. That's what Luis would have wanted." "Maybe," Danny said. "But he'd also want you to have something for yourself. You've given your whole life, Irene. Your hands are cracked from it." She looked at her palms, lined and rough, knuckles swollen from years of scrubbing, cooking, digging in the dirt. But they were still hers, and they had work left to do. Later that afternoon, as the city buzzed with whispers of Keanu Reeves visiting community centers, Irene pushed Rosie's stroller through the garden near the local church. She had told Camila she was going to water the cucumbers, but really she just needed air, needed quiet, needed to feel like the soil under her nails still meant something. She looked down at her bare hand and whispered, "I didn't lose you, Luis. I just passed the torch." And somewhere not far from her, a man in a dark shirt stepped into a shaded alley, unnoticed, his path about to cross hers in the most unexpected way. The next morning, Irene tucked the worn envelope into her coat pocket and stepped out just after sunrise. The air was still cool, the sidewalks damp from the sprinklers that had run before dawn. She took the long way to the corner store, passing early risers sweeping porches or sipping coffee. She nodded politely, clutching the envelope tighter every time she passed someone who might recognize her. At the store, the bright lights and hum of refrigerators made everything feel a little surreal. She picked up a plastic basket instead of a cart, not wanting to be tempted by things they didn't need. She moved carefully down the aisles. 2 loaves of whole wheat bread, 3 cans of black beans, a bag of brown rice, powdered milk, peanut butter, 2 boxes of oatmeal, dried lentils, and a dozen eggs. She hesitated at the fresh produce and chose a small bag of apples. Rosie loved them sliced and sprinkled with cinnamon. At checkout, the basket was heavy. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes and a nose ring, rang up the items slowly. Irene watched the total climb. $52. She nodded and pulled the envelope from her coat. The bills were crisp, fresh from Mr. Leon's drawer. She counted out exact change, murmuring thanks when the young man asked if she wanted a receipt. She walked another 6 blocks to a second store where chicken was on sale. She bought 2 packs of thighs, carefully selecting the cheapest per-pound option. Then she crossed the street to the discount pharmacy and picked up diapers for Rosie and a refill of Camila's iron pills. She paused outside a bookstore, eyeing some stories in the window. Mateo used to love those. He was almost too old now, but she still read to him at night when he let her. By the time she made it home, her arms ached from the bags. She knocked twice with her foot, and Mateo opened the door. "Whoa, Grandma," he said. "That's a lot of stuff." "I caught the sales," Irene said, brushing past him gently and setting the bags down in the kitchen. Camila looked up from the table where she was filling out job applications on her old tablet. "Mom, what's all this? Where did the money come from?" Irene bent to unpack the groceries. "I had a little saved from my sewing jobs." Camila looked doubtful. "You haven't had sewing work in months." "I had some stashed away. You always taught me to save." That was true, and Camila couldn't argue with it. Irene stored the food like she'd done for decades, arranging items with the same precision Louise used to admire. She kept the apples up high, where Rosie's little fingers couldn't reach them. The chicken she divided into freezer bags, labeling them in her neat handwriting. 2 thighs per meal, enough for 4 dinners if she stretched it with beans and rice. She tucked the last of the bills, still just over $800, 0 cents, into the back of Luis's old Bible. It lived on the top shelf of the closet between her winter sweaters and a box of baby pictures. Luis had written his name in the front cover the day they received it as a wedding gift. The ink was faded now, but the curl of his L still made her breath catch. She slid the envelope between Psalms and Proverbs, closed the cover gently, and pressed her hand to it. She didn't say anything out loud, not yet. But in her heart she whispered, "Just until we're back on our feet, Luis. I promise." Later that night, after the kids were in pajamas and Danny had taken his pain meds and was finally asleep, Irene sat on the couch folding laundry while the evening news played softly on the TV. Her phone buzzed twice and she ignored it. It was almost always junk. But then Mateo flopped beside her with a bowl of cereal and pointed to the screen. "Hey, isn't that Keanu Reeves?" Irene glanced up. It was a local segment, a fundraiser downtown. Keanu stood on a stage under string lights, smiling shyly as a local teacher spoke beside him. He wore a plain black jacket and dark jeans, his hair a little longer than usual, eyes soft but tired. "He's in Portland?" Irene asked. Mateo nodded. "Yeah, they said it was a surprise appearance, some school charity. He just showed up and donated a bunch of money. They say he's like really nice in real life. He always plays the hero. I think he is one." Irene smiled faintly, folding a baby onesie. "Maybe so." "You ever meet someone famous?" Mateo asked. "Your grandfather once shook hands with the governor. Does that count?" Mateo laughed, mouth full of cereal. "Only if there's a picture." "No picture," she said. But he was proud of it. As the story wrapped up, Keanu stepped off stage and helped a little girl adjust her microphone cord. It was quick, but Irene noticed. Quiet, gentle, not for the camera. She looked down at the empty spot on her hand. It felt colder tonight. Mateo was right. Some people wore capes. Others just wore kindness like second skin. That night, Irene lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling. The moonlight came through the blinds in thin silver slats, making shapes that reminded her of quilt patterns. She reached instinctively for the chain around her neck, Luis's silver cross, but her hand drifted lower, to the fourth finger of her left hand. It was still bare. She had taken the ring off only once in 55 years. When Luis died, she wore it still. When the kids buried him in his old flannel shirt, with his hands folded just so, she kept it on. Through every birthday and graduation, every scraped knee and report card, every burned casserole and Christmas morning, she had never removed it. Now her finger felt strange without it. She had scrubbed a stain off the sink earlier and paused, feeling like she was missing something important, like she had walked out without her shoes or left the stove on. She curled her hand under the blanket. She dreamed of Luis that night. He stood in the garden in his old work boots, holding a tomato, reaching for her. His face was lit by that half smile he used when he was proud of something she'd done but didn't want to embarrass her. He didn't speak. He never did in dreams. But she felt the warmth of his hand closing around hers. She woke just before dawn. Tears dried on her cheek and the house still. For a long while she didn't move. The baby hadn't stirred. The radiator ticked. The quiet was heavier than usual. She got up, pulled on her robe and made coffee. The first pot always belonged to her. She moved slowly through the tiny kitchen, warming her hands on the mug. The dark reminded her of Luis, how they lay awake after shifts, too tired to talk but still together. As the sky began to pale, Irene stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker off. Somewhere out there, Keanu Reeves was in the same city, walking quietly through lives like hers, without knowing it. She didn't believe in signs, but something about the timing, the news story, the fundraiser, Mateo's comment, felt like something was shifting. A thread tugged in a direction she couldn't yet see. She exhaled, grounding herself before the noise returned. The baby would cry soon. Camila would worry. The job boards would refresh with the same 10 listings and the same dead ends. Irene would slice apples, boil beans, count every dollar. And she would do it all without the gold band that used to remind her she was never doing it alone. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely alone now either. The sun was already climbing when Irene wrapped baby Rosie in a light blanket and laced up Lily's sneakers. Mateo had gone to a friend's for a school project, and Camila was at the library using the free Wi-Fi to apply for more jobs. Danny was resting with a heating pad. Irene needed fresh air, and so did the girls. "We're going to the garden," she told them, lifting Rosie gently from her playpen. Lily clapped. "Can I look for your ring again, Grandma?" Irene smiled faintly. "You can try." She'd packed a small lunch, filled 2 water bottles, and folded Rosie's stroller into the hallway. The neighborhood was just waking up. Coffee brewing behind cracked windows, a dog barking down the street, the mailman already making his slow rounds. The community garden sat on the edge of Alberta Park, tucked between the old recreation center and a narrow row of low-income housing. Irene had helped fight for that space 5 years ago after Louise passed. They had tried to build a parking lot, but she and a few other grandmothers had rallied the block. They'd planted the first tomatoes with borrowed tools and free seed packets. Now, the beds overflowed with vegetables, herbs, and sunflowers taller than most of the kids. As she opened the iron gate and pushed the stroller onto the mulch path, Rosie stirred. The baby blinked against the light, then reached for a sunflower petal near the fence. Lily darted ahead. "I'm going to check near the green beans." Irene settled Rosie under the shade of the communal picnic table. The breeze was soft. The air smelled of basil, damp soil, and something warm she couldn't quite name. Something that smelled like peace. She knelt beside her tomato bed, pulling off a few yellowing leaves and inspecting the heavy clusters of fruit. They were almost ready. Bright red, firm. Louise would have said they were the kind to slice thick, sprinkle with salt, and eat over the sink. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, but she saw Lily freeze. "Grandma," Lily called, pointing. "Someone's here." Jean stood up slowly, brushing her hands against her pants. A man stood just outside the row of carrots. He wore a faded baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses that hid most of his face. He was tall, his beard unkempt, his clothes casual. He held a paper cup of coffee and looked surprised to be noticed. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I didn't mean to intrude." Irene's first instinct was caution. Then Lily ran up to him without fear. "Hi, are you lost? We're looking for Grandma's ring." The man crouched to her level. "A ring, huh? Sounds important." "It is," Lily said. "She wore it forever, but we can't find it." Irene stepped forward. "We're okay, sir. This is a public space, but it's mostly neighbors." He stood slowly. "Of course, I was just passing through." But then he looked up, and Irene saw it. The familiar softness in his eyes, the quiet humility beneath the beard. Her breath caught. She knew that face. Keanu Reeves? Irene didn't say it out loud, but her heart knew. It wasn't just the face, though the eyes, even behind the sunglasses, gave him away. It was the stillness, the calmness in how he stood, like he didn't want to be noticed, like he'd spent years learning how to disappear into places that needed kindness. Lily didn't notice the weight of the moment. She tugged his sleeve eagerly. "You want to see Grandma's tomatoes? They're the best ones." He glanced at Irene, as if asking permission. She gave a small nod. "They're over here," she said, her voice steady. He followed Lily with a quiet smile, sipping from his coffee. Irene walked alongside him, Rosie bouncing gently in her stroller. They reached the tomato beds, nestled in the back corner of the garden. The plants were wild with fruit, deep red and heavy on the vine, Irene's pride and therapy. Each one had grown from seeds she saved herself. "These are yours?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Started them from scratch. They're better when the soil knows your name." He knelt to inspect one. "They look perfect." "Too perfect to sell," she said, "but just right to feed a family." There was a silence, not awkward, just real. The wind moved through the leaves and Rosie kicked her feet against the stroller tray. Keanu stood and looked around the garden. "This is beautiful." "It's not much," she said, "but it's ours." He turned toward her fully. "Irene, right?" She blinked. "How?" "I saw your name on the sign-in board near the gate," he said quickly, almost apologetically. "Not trying to startle you." "Oh," she said, heat rising to her cheeks. "Yes, Irene Martinez." He extended a hand. "It's nice to meet you." She hesitated, then took it. His grip was warm, steady. I know," she said gently. "I recognized you." He looked away for a moment, as if unsure whether to stay or go. But Lily, now picking tomatoes nearby, broke the tension. "These are from my mom," she said proudly, holding up 2 plump fruits. "She lost her job, but she's really good at making salsa." Keanu's eyes softened. "Is that so?" "Uh-huh. Grandma makes the tomatoes, Mom makes the salsa, and I eat the chips." He chuckled. Irene laughed too, surprised by how easy it felt. "Your granddaughter's got a good heart," he said. "She's got a big one," Irene replied. "We all do, just stretched thin lately." Keanu nodded, like he understood without needing an explanation. "I wasn't expecting company today," she added. "I wasn't expecting tomatoes," he said, glancing down at the vines. "But I'm glad I found them." They sat on the bench near the compost bins. Rosie had fallen asleep in the stroller, her tiny mouth half open. Lily sat cross-legged in the dirt, humming to herself while piling cherry tomatoes into her dress hem like a basket. Irene offered Keanu a paper napkin and one of the ripe tomatoes she'd just picked. "Try it," she said. He took it with a quiet nod and bit into it like an apple. Juice dripped down his wrist. He wiped it with the napkin, savoring the taste. "That's real," he said. "Tastes like sun and work." Irene smiled. The first real smile she'd felt in days. "Luis used to say that, my husband." He looked at her gently. "He's not here?" "Not anymore," she replied, looking at the sleeping baby. "He passed 5 years ago. But the garden helps. Growing things, it makes you feel less empty." He sat with that. Didn't rush to respond. That kind of silence, the kind that didn't need filling, was rare. "You raised this whole thing from nothing?" he asked. "With the help of a few stubborn women and a couple of donated shovels," she said. Lily interrupted, her voice cheerful. "Grandma's ring got lost here yesterday. We're trying to find it." Irene froze. Her hands tightened on the edge of the bench. Keanu turned to her. "That must have been important." 55 years important, she said softly, still not looking at him. "But it's okay. I'll find it. Or not." His eyes studied her, not pushing, just waiting. "It's silly," she added quickly, "just a ring." "It's never just a ring," he said. She looked at him, and for a second, she saw something deeper flicker behind his calm exterior. Grief. Memory. He knew what it was to carry something that no longer had a voice. He didn't ask questions. He just looked out across the garden and took another bite of the tomato. "I came here today to get away from noise," he said. "Didn't expect to find peace in a tomato bed." "It's where the best peace grows," she replied. Lily climbed into Irene's lap, still clutching a warm tomato. "Can he come again, Grandma?" "If he wants," Irene said. "I'd like that," Keanu answered. They sat in the quiet hum of the garden. One old woman with loss in her hands, one actor who came searching for quiet, one child who had no idea she'd just introduced her grandmother to someone who would soon change everything. Later, as Keanu walked away, he paused at the gate and looked back. Irene waved, a tomato in one hand, Lily on her hip, the ring still missing. But something else returned. Hope. The next morning, Irene didn't expect him to return, but there he was, leaning casually against the garden's front gate just after 9, coffee cup in hand, same worn cap and quiet presence. She blinked, wondering if she was imagining things. "You came back," she said as she wheeled Rosie in through the gate. "I was curious about those tomatoes," he replied, "and the gardener behind them." Lily skipped ahead, waving excitedly. "Hi again. We didn't find the ring yet, but we looked." Keanu crouched to her level. "Looking is half the fun." Irene smiled politely, unsure whether to invite him in or simply go about her tasks. But he was already walking beside her, quietly absorbing every detail. The layout of the garden beds, the way the rows curved with the sunlight, the chatter of other gardeners across the fence. She paused beside the compost bin and lifted the lid. A puff of warm earthiness escaped. "Ever use compost before?" she asked. Keanu shook his head. "I only know it smells like it has secrets." Irene chuckled. "It does. Banana peels, coffee grounds, old regrets. Give it time, and even the worst parts of life feed something new." He nodded slowly, letting her words settle. Then he asked, "How do you keep it from going sour?" "Turn it. Every week." "Let the air in," she answered. "Otherwise it rots instead of breaks down." He seemed to take mental notes. "And the soil, it looks different." "It's tired," she said, her voice lower now. "Too many seasons without enough nutrients. It needs resting and care and time." Keanu crouched beside one of the beds and touched the topsoil with his fingers, like he was listening to something deeper than sound. Irene stood beside him, watching. "You ask a lot of good questions for someone who just wandered into a garden." He smiled but didn't respond. She continued, almost despite herself. "Water's our biggest issue. City put in a spigot, but they monitor usage. If we go over the limit, they fine us. Some folks sneak buckets in from home, others give up." He nodded again. "What would help?" Keanu hesitated. "Rain barrels, mostly. Or a better irrigation system, something that doesn't punish people for trying to feed themselves." Keanu turned his gaze toward the beds, then back to her. His face was calm but intent, like he wasn't just listening, like he was remembering every word. Lily ran back up to them with dirt on her knees. "Grandma says even the weeds can be useful." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "That true?" "Only the clever ones," Irene said with a wink. They moved toward the sunflowers. Irene pointed out which plants attracted bees, which ones healed the soil, which ones just made the kids laugh when they bloomed too tall. She spoke with quiet authority, as someone who had learned by doing. Keanu listened, hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted, absorbing it all like light. And when Lily said, bright and sudden, "Grandma lost her wedding ring in the dirt," he didn't flinch. He simply looked at Irene's hand, then back to the soil, and said nothing. Irene cleared her throat and brushed her hand against her hip, as if trying to hide the bare finger. "It's just an old ring," she said quickly, trying to turn Lily's attention elsewhere. But Keanu didn't press. He nodded gently, then crouched again to study the base of a pepper plant. "You prune these often?" "Only the bottoms," Irene replied, grateful for the shift in subject. "Let the air flow underneath. Stops the mildew." "You know a lot," he said, his voice almost admiring. "I've had years," she said with a smile. "Louise, my husband, used to say I had a green soul." Keanu's eyes flicked to hers for a moment, then down again to the soil. I think he was right. They walked slowly toward the composting area again, past garden beds edged with reused bricks and worn planks. Irene showed him how she repurposed old soda bottles as drip irrigation, how the neighborhood donated seeds when they could, how they logged the harvests in a tattered notebook pinned to the tool shed wall. Keanu lingered on the page for a moment. You track everything? People take what they need, but we try to stay accountable. If you don't treat this place like it matters, no one else will. There was a pause. Then Keanu said, what if someone did treat it like it mattered? I mean, really mattered. Irene looked at him sideways. You mean, like someone famous dropping in to take notes? His expression softened. Maybe someone looking to learn. Not everything has to be a headline. She raised a brow but said nothing. Lily tugged his arm again. Do you want to see the strawberries? They're hiding. Keanu laughed and followed her toward the patch near the fence. Irene trailed behind, her eyes drifting back to the dirt bed where she'd once hidden the truth of the ring. She hadn't expected it to hurt this much, but saying it aloud, even in a child's voice, made it real again. Keanu returned holding a single ripe berry. She was right, he said. They were hiding. They do that, Irene replied. They wait until you're not looking and then turn sweet. They shared a quiet smile. Rosie stirred in the stroller, letting out a soft coo. Irene reached in and adjusted the blanket. Keanu looked at her with that same patient gaze. You built more than a garden here. It was all I had left, she whispered. When Luis died, I couldn't keep the house. But I could keep something growing, something honest. He nodded slowly, respectfully. That matters. They stood there for a moment, the strawberry in his hand, the weight of unspoken stories hanging between them. A bee drifted past, lazy in the sun. Then Lily pointed toward the tomato beds again. Let's look for the ring more. Maybe today's the lucky day. Keanu glanced at the soil. Maybe it is. And again, he didn't ask where the ring really went. He just listened, like someone who knew how it felt to bury something too valuable to explain. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows over the garden. Irene led Keanu toward a small corner where a bench sat, half buried, beneath honeysuckle vines. It was the quietest spot in the lot, shaded and slightly overgrown. Luis used to call it their secret corner. She gestured for him to sit, brushing off a few fallen leaves. This was his favorite spot, he'd say. If you sit still long enough, the plants start whispering. Keanu smiled as he settled beside her. Did they? Sometimes, Irene said. But mostly it was just him, whispering old songs he barely remembered the words to. She watched Lily chase a butterfly by the beans, giggling, her sundress fluttering around her knees. Rosie still slept in the stroller, one sock missing, her tiny foot poking out beneath the blanket. Keanu looked around again, taking it all in. The hand-built trellises, the cracked stone path, the reused rain gutters turned into planters. You did all this? Irene nodded, piece by piece, year by year. I didn't have money, just time, calluses, and neighbors who needed something beautiful. He turned to her slowly. If someone could help, really help, what would this place look like in 5 years? She considered that. A proper irrigation system, tools for kids, maybe a second garden on the east side. We have people waiting, but no room, and maybe a class or two, nutrition, compost, first aid. He listened without interruption. She hesitated, then added quietly, and maybe fewer people having to pawn their past to survive the present. His brow tightened slightly. Not judgment, just quiet empathy. She looked down at her hand again, at the empty spot that still felt foreign, no matter how many times she tried to ignore it. Keanu didn't look at her finger. He looked at her. You ever think of getting the ring replaced? He asked gently. No, she said, because it wasn't about the gold. It was about the years, the stories, the things we buried and survived together. He was quiet again. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, an old coin, battered and scratched. This was my father's, he said. Found it in a drawer after he passed. It's not worth anything, but I carry it when I want to remember who I came from." Irene's eyes softened. "And does it help?" "Sometimes," he said, "especially in places like this." Lily came running back, holding a handful of mint leaves and a crushed dandelion flower. "For you," she told Keanu, handing him the gift with a grin. He took it like it was gold. "Thank you, Lily." As they stood to leave, Irene placed a hand gently on Keanu's arm. "You never told me your name." He paused. "It's John." Irene tilted her head. "You don't look like a John." He smiled. "It's a quiet name, fits days like this." They walked back to the garden gate together. He didn't say goodbye, just tipped his cap and slipped into the soft light of evening. And Irene stood a moment longer, feeling something stir in the tired soil beneath her feet. The old TV in the corner of Leon's pawn and jewelry buzzed softly, its colors slightly faded from years of sun exposure. Mr. Leon was behind the glass counter, adjusting a clasp on a tarnished bracelet, when the local news switched to coverage of a charity fundraiser from the night before. The camera panned over volunteers and food trucks, then paused on a quiet figure in a worn baseball cap, standing with children near a garden bed. The shot only lasted a few seconds, but Mr. Leon dropped the bracelet mid-pulish. He knew that face. The beard was shorter now, the cap different. But it was him. "That's the guy," he whispered to himself, slowly rising. "That's the man who walked through my door." He'd seen the stranger 2 days ago, lingering around the neighborhood. No one else seemed to notice, but Mr. Leon always noticed. He'd made a career of it, observing, reading between the lines, seeing what others missed. And now it all clicked. Keanu Reeves. He'd heard rumors that the actor was in Portland for some kind of secret charity event, but like most of the neighborhood, he had assumed it was just talk. No one expected someone like that to show up on the east side of town, and certainly not at Irene's garden. Mr. Leon turned off the TV and reached for his logbook. He flipped through the entries until he found the familiar handwriting. Neat, precise, written with dignity. Irene Martinez. Item: 1 gold wedding band, 3 small diamonds, purchased for $900, 0 cents. He stared at the line for a long moment. Irene had said very little when she came in, just that she needed the money. She didn't haggle, she didn't cry, but her fingers trembled when she placed the ring on the counter. And her eyes, they held something that haunted him even now. She'd worn that ring for over half a century. Mr. Leon knew because she told him. But she also told him not to worry about it, that she wouldn't be back for it. Still, he'd kept it in the velvet tray longer than necessary, hoping maybe she'd change her mind, come back with some excuse to undo it all. But last week, when the holding period expired, he'd done what he always did. He sold it to Gil Harmon, the gold buyer a few blocks over. Only now, something didn't sit right. It wasn't guilt, exactly. Mr. Leon had seen 1,000 people come through his doors with stories tucked beneath their ribs. But this felt different. This one wasn't over. He grabbed his keys, locked the shop, and crossed the street. A gust of cool morning air whipped his coat as he headed toward Gil's store. The ring might still be there, untouched. He could buy it back, maybe gift it to Irene, or at least tell her it wasn't lost forever. He didn't know what he'd say, only that he had to try. Gil Harmon's shop wasn't as tidy as Mr. Leon's. The windows were smudged, and the neon sign that read TOP dollar for gold flickered with a tired hum. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old metal and industrial cleaner. Gil stood behind the counter in his usual uniform, denim shirt, reading glasses on a chain, and a half-finished sandwich sitting next to the cash register. "Well, if it isn't Leon the Lion," Gil said, glancing up from a tray of rings. "What brings you here before 10? Your espresso machine break?" "I need to ask about a sale I made," Leon said without humor. "A gold wedding band, 3 small diamonds, Woman sold it to me a few weeks ago. Gil's fingers paused mid-sort. You mean the Irene Martinez ring? You remember it? Of course I do. Solid little piece. Not worth much in melt value, but it had that character. I don't usually care about that kind of thing, but this one had a story. Leon stepped closer to the glass. Is it still here? Gil shook his head. No. Sold it 2 days ago. Private collector. Leon's stomach sank. You mind telling me who? Gil hesitated, then shrugged. Guy's name is Julian Cross, some upscale jeweler out of Bend. Says he collects pieces with emotional provenance. Sentimental items with public interest. Sounded like he knew about Irene. Might have seen the interview she gave Channel 8 last month about her garden. Leon frowned. So he bought it for the story, not the gold? Exactly. He even told me not to clean it. Said the scratches added narrative weight. Paid well, too. Leon cursed under his breath. Do you have his contact info? Gil reached under the counter, pulled out a notepad, and scribbled an address and a phone number. Here. But good luck. That guy doesn't part with anything once it's in his collection, especially if there's press attached. Leon folded the paper carefully, as if it were something fragile. I appreciate it. Gil looked at him more closely now. Why the sudden interest? That ring already on your books? Leon considered brushing it off, saying it was just a feeling or that he'd been asked to track it down, but instead, he told the truth. Because the man who visited Irene in the garden, the one who asked about tomatoes, compost, irrigation, I saw him on the news last night. Gil blinked. Wait, the guy with the beard? That wasn't just a guy, Leon said. That was Keanu Reeves. Gil let out a low whistle. No way. Leon nodded. And I think he wasn't just there for the vegetables. He stepped away from the counter, his mind already turning. I don't think he'd want this story to end with a lost ring sitting in some glass case for rich clients to gawk at. Gil leaned back, watching him go. Leon, he called. You think he'd actually care? Leon turned in the doorway. If he's the man I saw in that garden, yeah, I think he already does. Mr. Leon didn't return to his shop. Instead, he took a detour, one that felt like a long shot even as he made the turn. The address he remembered was vague, passed to him weeks ago through a whisper in the antique circles. If you ever find something that might move the heart of a man with reach, someone had said, send it to the Reeves Foundation downtown. Quiet hands. Open ears. He didn't even know if the actor actually worked there. Most people assumed it was a name on a letterhead. But Leon knew when to trust a hunch. And the look in Irene's eyes that day, one of surrender, not selfishness, still tugged at him like a thread he couldn't untangle. Downtown Portland was just starting to stir when he arrived. The Foundation's building wasn't flashy. A converted schoolhouse, pale brick, with a narrow sign reading simply, The Reeves Initiative. Inside, the receptionist was young and sharply polite. May I help you? Mr. Leon cleared his throat. I need to speak to someone about a ring. A wedding ring that belonged to a woman named Irene Martinez. I believe Mr. Reeves met her recently in a garden. She tilted her head slightly, measuring him with quiet suspicion. And who are you? Someone trying to put a story back together before it gets lost. A pause, then she stood. Wait here. He waited. Minutes passed. A clock ticked behind the counter. Then soft footsteps approached from a hallway. A woman in her 30s appeared. Dark hair, a portfolio tucked beneath her arm. Calm in the way people become when they deal with the unexpected daily. You're the man from the pawn shop? She asked. Leon nodded. Eduardo Leon. I sold Irene Martinez's ring. I'm trying to get it back. Her expression didn't shift much, but her eyes sharpened. And why bring that here? He handed her the notepad slip. Because a collector bought it. Julian Cross. I can't outbid him. But I thought maybe someone here could. The woman studied the note, then tucked it under her portfolio. Mr. Reeves isn't here today, but I'll make sure he sees this. Can you leave your number? Leon scrawled it on the pad. I don't want attention, just if there's a way to get it back to her. She nodded once. Understood. As Leon walked back to his car, he didn't know what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe the ring would stay locked away forever in some velvet-linged drawer. But maybe, just maybe, it would find its way home. Because some stories didn't end in the pawn shop. Some whispered their way into the hands of people who still believed in returning what mattered most. And if anyone could hear a whisper like that, it was Keanu Reeves. The soup smelled of lentils, cumin, and rosemary. Keanu stirred the pot slowly, his sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour. He liked the rhythm of kitchens, steam hissing, spoons clinking, the hush of people grateful for a warm meal. The community center in Northeast Portland had become a quiet refuge for him, a place where no one asked for selfies or autographs, just service, just hands that helped. He moved down the line, ladling soup into biodegradable bowls, nodding to each person with a quiet enjoy. The line of guests shuffled along, men with weathered coats, mothers with tired eyes, teenagers trying not to look ashamed. Keanu never asked their stories. He believed in offering dignity without the demand for details. He had just finished serving the last bowl when a voice behind him asked, "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu turned, wiping his hands. A man stood near the hallway, holding his cap in one hand. Trim gray hair, nervous eyes, and something about his posture. A kind of quiet guilt. "Yes," Keanu said, stepping toward him. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated, then extended his hand. "My name's Eduardo Leon. I own a small pawn shop on 14th and Alberta. I'm not sure how to say this except plain." Keanu gave a gentle nod. Plain is good. "I came about a woman named Irene Martinez. I think you met her." Something shifted in Keanu's face, just slightly, but he didn't interrupt. He answers the widow, 74, lives with her daughter, son-in-law, and 3 grandkids in a little apartment off Jefferson. Leon rubbed the brim of his cap, suddenly looking 10 years older. "She's the one who started the community garden. I think you might have..." Keanu's expression softened. "Yes, I did." Leon took a breath. "She came to my shop last month, sold her wedding ring for $900, said it was for groceries, didn't want anyone to know, not her daughter, not her grandkids. She told them she lost it in the dirt." Keanu's brow furrowed, his arms crossed loosely. Still, he said nothing. "I didn't realize at the time how much it meant. Just thought it was a sad transaction like so many others. But then I saw you on the news, standing in her garden, and I realized maybe it wasn't over yet." Leon reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "I tried to get the ring back. Went to the gold dealer I sold it to. But it's already gone. Sold to a collector named Julian Cross, jeweler up in Bend. He likes sentimental pieces, ones with stories." Keanu took the paper without a word, scanned the name, tucked it into his pocket. "Do you have a picture of the ring?" Leon nodded quickly and pulled out his phone. 3 tiny diamonds, one slightly higher in the middle. The band has a scratch under the setting. "She caught it on a drawer once," she said. Keanu studied the screen for a long moment. Then he looked up, his voice quiet and steady. "I'll take care of it." Mr. Leon stood still for a moment, unsure if the conversation was over. Keanu's words had been final, but not dismissive. It wasn't a brush-off, it was a promise. Quiet and absolute, the kind that didn't need embellishment. Still, Eduardo hesitated. "I just thought," he began again, "someone like her deserves to have something come back to her, not because she asked, but because she didn't." Keanu looked him in the eye. "You're right." He didn't explain how deeply he understood what Leon meant, how he had seen the kind of dignity Irene carried, the quiet, unshakable kind that never shouted for attention but left ripples in every space it touched. Her hands in the soil, the way she spoke to her granddaughter, the way she smiled when she talked about tomatoes and compost, as if they were sacred knowledge. Keanu pulled off his apron and set it gently on the counter. "Let's walk outside." They stepped through the side door into the alley behind the community kitchen. It was quiet here, save for the soft hum of city life, the occasional rumble of a distant train, the echo of a skateboarder turning a corner, the faint song of wind through gutters. "Do you know why she didn't tell them?" Keanu asked, his voice low. Leon nodded. "Pride, or maybe protection. I think when people get older, they still want to be the ones giving, not receiving." Keanu nodded slowly. "And sometimes the world forgets how heavy giving becomes when you have nothing left." They stood in silence. Then Keanu reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and tapped a message. "Julian Cross," he murmured aloud, as if to anchor the name. "Sentimental collector. What do you know about him?" "Private," Leon said. "Hard to reach unless you're someone." "I'm not someone, but you." Keanu smiled faintly. "Let's not assume that gives me an advantage. Some people only open their doors for money, not meaning." Leon paused, then asked carefully, "Are you going to offer to buy it back?" "I'll offer something," Keanu said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "But not just for the ring, for the truth inside it." Leon looked at him curiously. Keanu didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, steady, resolute, carried all the intent behind the words. The alley light above them flickered. Leon glanced toward the street, unsure if he should linger. "You did the right thing, Mr. Leon," Keanu said. "It takes character to correct a mistake. I still feel like I failed her." "You didn't," Keanu replied. "You just passed the torch." Leon took a breath, nodded once, and stepped into the late afternoon light. Keanu stayed behind, the paper still in his pocket, the image of the ring etched in his mind. It wasn't just gold. It wasn't just diamonds. It was love disguised as sacrifice, and now it was his to find. That evening, after the kitchen closed and the last of the chairs were stacked, Keanu sat alone in the break room with the lights dimmed. He held the phone in one hand, still looking at the image of the ring Eduardo had shown him. He studied it not as a jeweler or a collector would, but like someone who knew the weight of memory, how a single object could carry half a century of breath, heartbreak, and laughter. He thought of Irene's eyes, the way they had lit up as she knelt beside the tomato vines, brushing soil from the stems with hands that knew the earth's moods. He thought of Lily's innocent voice, "Grandma lost her wedding ring in the dirt," and how Irene's smile had faltered for just a second before returning, soft and brave. Some lies weren't born from shame, some were forged from love. He tapped a contact on his screen. It rang only twice. "Sarah," he said when she picked up. "I need you to do something." He explained everything quickly, his voice low and steady. The pawn shop, the gold dealer, the collector, Julian Cross. Sarah didn't ask why. She never did. She just said, "I'll find him." Keanu ended the call and sat in silence. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft thump of his fingers against the table. The ring wasn't just a ring. It was a tether. To Irene's husband, Luis. To everything she had built and quietly held together. She had traded it not for comfort, but for survival. So that her grandchildren wouldn't go hungry, so that her daughter could feel like a mother, even when she couldn't provide. He reached for his notebook, a black leather journal that traveled with him more places than any assistant. On a blank page, he wrote, "She gave up the symbol, not the meaning. And somehow, the meaning made its way back. Now we follow that thread, quietly, until it leads home." He closed the notebook gently and placed it in his bag. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and fallen leaves. Portland's spring always carried a hush, like the city was still thawing from something long and silent. As he walked out into the night, his boots soft against the pavement, Keanu made no announcements, no calls to publicists, no tweets. This wasn't for headlines. This was for a woman who once fed 100 children a day on a school kitchen budget. For the hands that had planted hope in community soil. For a ring that had slept next to the pulse of love for over 5 decades before being surrendered to hunger. He would find a way to bring it back, even if he had to offer more than money, even if the world never knew he did it. Julian Cross didn't advertise his collection. He didn't need to. If you knew the right questions to ask, his name would surface like a whispered answer. Keanu Reeves sat in the back of a quiet sedan as it rolled through the Pearl District of Portland. His assistant Sarah had tracked down Julian's shop within hours, Cross Collections, tucked behind a red brick building and shielded by ivy so thick it looked like a secret. No social media, no website, no storefront sign, just a polished brass plate and a bell that chimed when you stepped inside. When Keanu entered, the scent of sandalwood and old books greeted him first. The second thing was the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was intentional. Every surface gleamed, every frame was dusted. Wedding dresses from the 1930s hung behind glass. Faded telegrams were mounted in museum-quelled cases. This wasn't a pawn shop. It was a place where memory was curated. Behind the main counter stood Julian Cross. He looked exactly like someone who believed in preserving the past. A pressed navy vest, round tortoiseshell glasses, and silver hair combed neatly back. When he saw Keanu, he smiled. Not starstruck, but as if he'd expected him. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," Julian said. Keanu nodded once. "I'm here about a ring. Gold. 3 small diamonds. Came from Gil Harmon's exchange. Sold last week." Julian didn't blink. He reached beneath the counter and carefully placed a small, velvet-lined case on the glass. "I remember it well," he said. "A woman's wedding ring, worn, humble, but honest." Keanu stared at the case for a long moment before finally asking, "May I?" Julian opened the lid with a practiced hand. Inside was Irene's ring. It looked smaller now than it had in her memories, but it carried every year, every sacrifice. The diamonds were modest, but the band shimmered faintly in the light. He didn't touch it. He only looked. "I'd like to buy it back," Keanu said. Julian watched him carefully, as if weighing something deeper than money. Julian Cross never needed advertisements. His business thrived on whispers. Quiet referrals passed between antique dealers, estate attorneys, and the rare few who understood the emotional value behind forgotten heirlooms. In Portland's Pearl District, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and a weather-worn gate, his storefront didn't look like much. No sign, no glowing open light, just a discreet brass plate on the door that read, "Cross Collections, private clients only." Keanu Reeves stepped from the black sedan and paused outside. He studied the ivy, the old bricks, the faint aroma of smoke and sandalwood that clung to the alley air. His assistant, Sarah, stood beside him. "He's expecting you," she said quietly, and nodded toward the door. Inside, the space opened like a library of memory. Wooden floors creaked underfoot. Lamps cast golden light over velvet displays and polished glass. Framed photographs, antique watches, dried flower corsages, and love letters from wartime sweethearts filled every shelf. Not junk, not even history. These were fragments of lives, preserved, polished, revered. Behind the counter stood Julian Cross, as if carved from the same mahogany as his desk. He wore a crisp vest over a starched shirt, and his silver hair was swept back neatly. His eyes were sharp, not surprised. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said with a faint smile. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu stepped forward. "I believe you acquired a wedding ring last week. Gold band, 3 small diamonds. Came through Gil Harmon." Julian's fingers tapped the glass lightly. "I remember." He bent, opened a drawer, and retrieved a small velvet box. With reverent care, he set it between them and opened it slowly. There it was. The ring wasn't flashy. It didn't scream wealth or prestige, but it radiated something deeper. Years. Love. Sacrifice. The diamonds shimmered softly in the lamplight, and the band had a worn edge, shaped by time and habit. Keanu didn't touch it. He looked at Julian. "I'd like to buy it back." Julian didn't blink. He clasped his hands gently in front of him and studied Keanu as if weighing his soul. "I thought you might say that," he said. Julian didn't move. The velvet box sat open between them like an offering neither man dared disturb. Keanu kept his tone steady. "It belongs to someone who gave it up for reasons no one should have to. I'd like to return it to her." Julian nodded slowly, eyes never leaving the ring. "I believe you." He reached under the counter and brought out a slim leather notebook. Inside were delicate sketches and notes in looping script, item histories, acquisition dates, source notes. He turned to the page marked with a paperclip and tapped it. "Team sold it at a pawn shop, needed money. Didn't leave a name, but I did some digging. Irene Martinez, former school cook, widowed, lives with her daughter and grandkids. Sound right?" Keanu gave a quiet nod. Julian looked back down at the ring. "I collect more than gold and gems, Mr. Reeves. I collect moments. Symbols of lives lived quietly but meaningfully. This one? It has gravity. You can feel it when you hold it." He closed the notebook. Keanu reached into his coat and took out a sealed envelope. "I'll offer 20,000. No questions, no publicity, just the ring." Julian didn't even glance at the envelope. "It's not about the money." "Then name your price." "There isn't one." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "You'd keep a ring that could return decades of meaning to someone, just to keep it in a case?" Julian's voice was calm. "I would keep it because that's where its story was meant to pause. The act of giving it up, that's part of its journey now." "I don't erase stories, Mr. Reeves. I protect them. But this one isn't finished," Keanu replied, softer now. Julian didn't answer. He reached out and gently closed the velvet box. "I've had pieces worn by Holocaust survivors, civil rights marchers, mothers who buried children. I treat every one of them like sacred scripture. This one, it's different, but the weight is the same." Keanu stared at the box. His fingers twitched once, but he didn't reach for it. "What if I offered a donation? In your name, children's programs, art grants, 100,000. Julian smiled politely. "Noble, but no. Because this ring isn't currency anymore. It's something purer than that now." Keanu exhaled slowly, gaze distant. "She doesn't even know I'm doing this." "Then maybe you're not doing it for her," Julian said gently. "Maybe you're doing it for yourself." That hit a nerve. But Keanu said nothing. He simply nodded once, as if accepting the strike, and stepped back. He offered his hand. "Thank you for your time." Julian shook it firmly. "You're welcome to visit any time. I suspect we're not as different as you think." As Keanu turned to go, his voice drifted behind him, quiet and firm. "There's always another way." The door chimed softly as Keanu stepped out into the afternoon air, the sound barely audible above the hum of distant traffic. The sky had turned gray, not quite stormy, but heavy with the kind of clouds that linger, waiting, watching. He pulled up the collar of his coat and paused on the sidewalk. Sarah joined him quietly. "I really wouldn't sell?" she asked. Keanu shook his head. 20,000. A donation offer. Nothing moved him. Sarah glanced back at the ivy-covered storefront. "Julian Cross has refused offers from oil barons and art museums. He doesn't budge." Keanu stared at the street ahead, brows drawn in thought. He called it sacred, said it has weight. "Did you feel it?" she asked gently. Keanu didn't answer at first. Then, yes. There was a long silence as they walked slowly down the block. Keanu's hands remained deep in his pockets, but his mind had already left the sidewalk. He was somewhere else entirely. Seeing Irene's weathered hands pulling weeds from soil, the way she'd smiled through tired eyes, her voice gentle and sure as she spoke about planting food for people who couldn't afford much else. "She sold the ring to feed her family," he said quietly. "And she lied about it so they wouldn't feel ashamed. That kind of love doesn't belong in a display case." Sarah studied him for a moment. "What are you going to do?" He didn't stop walking. "Find another way. We could try legal options. Appeal to a public interest case. It would take time." Keanu shook his head. "That's not how this works. Cross isn't holding it out of malice. He believes he's doing something noble. But if it stays there, it won't." Keanu's voice was calm but resolute. "That ring isn't meant to rest behind glass. It's meant to return to her hand, quietly, without fanfare, without the world watching." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you want me to reach out to the press? Sometimes light pressure—" "No press," Keanu said firmly. "That ruins the meaning. This isn't about headlines." They reached the car and Keanu paused with his hand on the door. "Find out what Julian Cross loves more than his collection," he said quietly. "Not what he buys, what he believes in, what he wants to protect. You think that'll help? I think everyone has something they'll trade for, if you speak to the right part of them." He slid into the back seat and closed the door behind him, leaving Sarah on the sidewalk with the task echoing in her thoughts. As the car pulled away, Keanu didn't look back. His voice, soft but certain, carried forward through the quiet interior. She gave up everything for the people she loves. If I can't do the same for her, what kind of man would I be? And with that, the search for a new path began. The phone rang just after Irene had finished sweeping the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the cordless phone, expecting it to be Camila or perhaps one of the school robocalls about Mateo's attendance. But when she answered, a calm voice with a slight East Coast accent greeted her. "Mrs. Irene Martinez, this is Grace Liu, assistant to Keanu Reeves." Irene blinked, frozen. "I'm sorry, who?" "Grace Liu. I work for Mr. Reeves. He recently met you at the Westwood Community Garden. He asked me to extend an invitation on his behalf." Irene sat down slowly at the kitchen table, her knees suddenly unsteady. Yes. I remember meeting a man at the garden. We talked about compost and tomatoes." A soft chuckle on the other end. "Yes, that would be him. He was very impressed. Mr. Reeves is holding a small meeting tomorrow afternoon, just a few local community leaders, to discuss urban farming initiatives. He hoped you'd attend." "Me?" Irene laughed softly, unsure if it was a prank or some bizarre misunderstanding. "I'm not a leader. I'm a gardener. I volunteer. I help where I can." "That's exactly why he'd like you there," Grace replied. "You know the land, the people, the work. That's the voice we need in the room." There was a long pause. Irene glanced down at her hands, calloused and cracked from years in the kitchen and in soil. Her heart beat faster. "Would you be available tomorrow at 1 p.m.?" Grace asked gently. I suppose I could," Irene said slowly. "Where is it?" Grace provided the address. An arts and community center downtown, newly restored after years of vacancy. "There will be refreshments," she added, "and you're welcome to bring a family member if that makes you more comfortable." After confirming a few more details, the call ended as quietly as it had begun. Irene sat at the table for a long moment, phone still in hand. When Camila returned from the food pantry with a bag of canned beans and instant rice, Irene met her at the door. "Mia," she said, still dazed, "you won't believe who just called." Camila raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me lottery." No. Someone named Grace. She works for Keanu Reeves." Camila blinked. "Wait, what?" "Elle wants me to come to a meeting. About community farming? Tomorrow." Camila dropped the grocery bag onto the counter. "Wait. Keanu Reeves? The actor? The one Lily said you met in the garden?" "I didn't know it was him," Irene said, throwing her hands in the air. "He had a beard and a hat. He just looked like a kind man who liked tomatoes." Camila stared for a moment. Then she broke into a grin. "You have to go, Mom. This could be something amazing." The next morning arrived quietly, the sky a blanket of soft gray above the city. Irene stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing down the few wisps of gray hair that refused to stay in place. She had chosen her navy blue cardigan, the one Luis used to call her church sweater, and a floral skirt she hadn't worn in months. Nothing fancy, but it felt respectful, presentable. Camila knocked gently on the doorframe. "You look good, Mom, dignified, like a senator, but with more tomatoes." Irene laughed, adjusting the collar of her cardigan. "You're sure this isn't?" "Absolutely not. Mom, you've spent years helping everyone else. Let someone hear your voice for once." At 12:30, a black town car pulled up in front of their apartment. Irene almost didn't want to step outside. She worried neighbors would stare. But when Mateo helped open the front gate, waving as if she were a movie star, she forced herself to lift her chin and smile. The ride downtown was smooth and quiet. Irene clutched her purse tightly on her lap, her fingers rubbing the edge of a folded note card she had slipped inside, just in case she needed to remember what to say. When the car pulled up in front of the restored community center, Irene's breath caught. The building looked like something from another world, gleaming glass doors, flower beds that mirrored the ones she tended, and a banner above the entrance that read, "Community grows here." Grace Liu met her at the door, all warmth and professionalism. "Mrs. Martinez," she said with a slight bow, "we're honored to have you." "I'm honored to be asked," Irene replied, her voice smaller than she intended. Inside, the center smelled faintly of citrus and wood polish. Sunlight poured through tall windows. Irene was led into a small conference room where folding chairs had been arranged in a circle. A table in the corner held pitchers of water, cut fruit, and sandwiches carefully labeled for allergies. There were maybe a dozen other people present: an urban beekeeper, a nutritionist, 2 young women from a school lunch reform group, and a tall woman in overalls with soil still under her fingernails. And then she saw him. Keanu was pouring himself a glass of water, still in the same battered baseball cap and quiet demeanor as before. But now that she knew who he was, the disguise seemed almost silly. He looked up, caught her eye, and offered a gentle smile. "I'm glad you came, Irene." She walked toward him slowly. "You really are him." He chuckled softly. "I've been accused of that before." "I should have known," she muttered. "You listened like an actor. Or a priest." "No costume today," he replied, motioning toward the empty chair beside his. "Would you sit next to me? I want to hear what you think about soil fatigue." Irene blinked, then nodded. "Only if you're ready to hear the truth." Irene took her seat beside Keanu. still unsure why she had been invited, but warmed by the sense of quiet respect in the room. These weren't people talking for attention. They were listening, learning, planning something that felt bigger than any one person. Keanu leaned forward as the meeting began, nodding to Grace, who stood to welcome the group. "Thank you all for being here," Grace said. "Today's session is about understanding what truly makes a garden thrive. Not just the plants, but the people who grow them. We've asked a few guests, including Irene Martinez, to share insights from their community experience." Irene froze. "Oh, I didn't know I was speaking." "You don't have to," Grace replied kindly. "But if you're willing, we'd love to hear anything you'd like to share." Keanu looked over and gave a soft nod. "No pressure, but I think you have more to offer than you realize." Irene's fingers touched the inside of her wrist, where the ring had once rested for over 5 decades. She took a breath. "When I started gardening after my husband passed," she said slowly, "I wasn't trying to grow anything special. I just wanted to feel useful. The soil doesn't ask how old you are or how much money you have. It just asks for patience." The room quieted. "I see a lot of programs try to teach gardening like it's a checklist. Compost, sunlight, irrigation. But the best gardens I've seen came from folks who learned because they were hungry, or healing, or trying to make something beautiful in a place that had forgotten how to bloom." Keanu listened, his eyes focused but calm. "How much of the biggest things we need," she continued, "is not just dirt and seeds, it's dignity. A garden should never feel like charity. It should feel like pride." Someone near the back clapped softly, then others joined in. Irene flushed with color, not used to applause. After the meeting, as people mingled and shared contact info, Keanu stayed beside her. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "That's exactly what this is about." "I didn't mean to give a speech," she replied sheepishly. "You didn't," he said. "You gave a truth." They stood together near the wide windows, sunlight streaking across the floor. Keanu turned to her once more. "Would you be open to helping us with something?" Irene raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "A pilot project," he said. "A new kind of community initiative. Real families, real gardens, led by someone who understands that food is just one part of nourishment." She looked away for a moment, unsure what to say. "You don't have to decide now," he added. Irene smiled faintly. "If I'm going to help, Mr. Reeves, you'd better be ready for honest opinions and calloused hands." He grinned. "That's exactly what we're counting on." The hall was warm with quiet conversation, the kind that buzzed just under the sound of the kettle in the back. Irene adjusted the sleeves of her blouse, looking out of place among the polished presentations and sleek folders laid out on the long wooden table. She clutched her tote bag, which still smelled faintly of rosemary and soil. Then the door opened. Keanu Reeves walked in with that familiar calm, dressed simply, no fanfare, just a quiet nod to the group as he stepped forward. Irene blinked once, then twice. Her hand twitched toward her neck. The man from the garden. The one Lily had shown her tomatoes to, the one who'd asked about compost. He walked directly toward her. "Ian," he said warmly, holding out his hand. "It's good to see you again." She stood slowly, bewildered. "You're," he smiled gently, "just someone who likes tomatoes and good people." The other attendees gave them space, sensing this was something different. Keanu gestured toward a chair. "Come sit with me. I've got something to show you." Irene obeyed, still silent. The weight of his presence didn't come from fame. It came from something else. A gravity, like kindness made solid. Keanu placed a small folder in front of her. Inside were photos of empty lots across Portland. Cracked pavement, overgrown grass, trash-strewn corners. Then the images changed. Green spaces, raised beds, wooden signs hand-painted by children. Transformation. Possibility. "Geese," he said, "are the first candidates for the Green Block Project. We want to turn these neglected lots into thriving food gardens, built by and for the community, accessible, sustainable. Yeah, Irene looked at him, her fingers trembling slightly over the edge of the page. You have experience, he said. You've built something out of nothing. I saw that. I heard it in the way you talked to your granddaughter. I saw it in the tomatoes. I just grow things, she whispered. Keanu smiled. Exactly. He slid a second page toward her. It listed details. Title: Community Green Block Director. Annual salary: $72,000, 0 cents. Benefits: full health coverage for her and listed dependents, plus a monthly stipend earmarked for family healthcare expenses. Irene stared at the numbers like they were written in another language. I'm just a grandma with a shovel, she murmured, stunned. Keanu leaned forward, eyes steady and sincere. That's exactly who we need. The words dropped into the quiet like seeds into fertile earth. Her hands tightened in her lap. For a long time, Irene had felt like she was too old for beginnings, too tired for change. But something was blooming in her chest now. Something wild, unexpected, and alive. He smoothed her skirt with both hands, trying to steady her breathing. Around her, the quiet sounds of the room faded into the background. Her fingers grazed the folder again, tracing the lines of the job description, like it might vanish if she blinked. Keanu didn't press her. He let the silence stretch, calm and patient, as if he understood the magnitude of what she was holding. I never even finished high school, Irene said finally, her voice shaky. I got my GED when I turned 52, but I've never had a real job. I worked in a school kitchen. I know how to plant tomatoes and stretch beans into 3 meals. But directing something? That's too big. Keanu nodded, not to dismiss her, but as though he'd expected that answer. Do you remember what you told Lily the first time you brought her to the garden? Irene blinked. What? You told her, every seed carries its future. You just have to give it a place to grow. He smiled, soft and knowing. That's leadership. Irene's throat tightened. She hadn't known he'd heard that. Keanu continued. You already know what people need, what real families are going through. Most of the experts we hire come in with charts and theories. You come in with muddy hands and a heart that knows hunger. But I'm 74, she said, more to herself than to him. And I've never even been on a computer without help from Mateo. He laughed gently. We'll pair you with a coordinator for the technical stuff. You'll guide the vision, the community, the purpose, the things no degree can teach. Diame looked down at her hands. They were lined and calloused, knuckles swollen from arthritis, fingernails always rimmed with soil she could never quite scrub away, hands that had fed children, tucked in grandbabies, buried a husband. Not the hands of a director, but maybe the hands of a builder. What about my family? She asked, softly. The stipend will cover your daughter and your son-in-law, Keanu said. Your grandkids, too. Medical, groceries, whatever's needed. I want you to do this without worry. Irene's eyes welled up. You don't even know us. I know enough, he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her mind was spinning. For years, every decision had been about survival, about making dollars stretch and food last, about what they could go without. But this was about creating something, not just for her family, but for everyone like them. She reached out slowly, her fingers hovering over the folder again. Then she closed it. May I think about it tonight? Keanu nodded. Of course. He stood and extended his hand. Irene took it, surprised again by the gentleness in his grip. Just one thing, she added as she rose. Yes? If I say yes, we build gardens our way. Real ones, no fancy nonsense. Keanu smiled. That's the only way I want it. By the time Irene left the meeting hall, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long amber streaks across the sidewalk. The folder was clutched tightly to her chest, like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. The city around her buzzed with its usual rhythm, but to Irene, everything felt hushed, like the world was waiting on her next move. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her mind racing in a way it hadn't in years. She thought of Camila's quiet exhaustion each night, of Danny icing his back with the bathroom light off, of Mateo skipping second helpings, saying he wasn't hungry when he obviously was. She thought of Lily's giggles in the garden, of baby Rosie falling asleep on her chest, fingers curled around the cross she wore on a chain. Could this job change that? The bus pulled up, groaning to a stop. Irene climbed aboard, lowering herself carefully into a seat near the back. As the city rolled by, she stared out the window and tried to picture it, herself in charge of something that mattered. Not just planting tomatoes, but building hope. Not just for her family, but for people she hadn't even met yet. She touched her bare ring finger again. When she got home, Camila was folding laundry at the kitchen table. Danny was asleep on the couch, the TV flickering with muted news footage. Mateo looked up from his homework. "How was it?" Camila asked, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the worry behind her eyes. Irene placed the folder gently on the table and sat down. "They want me to lead something," she said. "Something called the Green Block Project." Mateo's eyes lit up. "That's the thing they were talking about on the news with Mr. Reeves. He's turning abandoned places into gardens." Camilla blinked. "Wait, you met Keanu Reeves? That Keanu?" Irene nodded slowly. "He was the man at the garden that day. I didn't recognize him either." Camilla covered her mouth, eyes wide. "Oh, Mama?" Irene smiled faintly. "He offered me a job. A real job. With a salary and benefits for all of you." Camilla sank into the chair beside her, stunned. Mateo stood up. "That's amazing, Grandma. You have to say yes." "I haven't yet," Irene said gently. "It's a lot to think about." Danny stirred on the couch. "Say yes," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "If someone's finally seeing your worth, don't you dare say no." Beyond Amura, Irene looked around at the tired faces she loved more than anything. She had spent years carrying them. Could it be time to help carry others too? She picked up the folder again. Maybe it wasn't too big after all. Irene walked up the steps to their second-floor apartment with slow, measured steps. Her purse felt heavier than usual, not because of anything inside, but because of everything she hadn't yet said. The lightness in her chest from the meeting was quickly being replaced by the ache of a long-kept secret about to surface. She had worn this silence like a second skin, convincing herself it was for the good of the family. But Keanu's words, "That's exactly who we need," kept echoing in her mind. And with them, the knowledge that honesty, no matter how late, was long overdue. Inside, the apartment smelled of simmering rice and warm tortillas. Camila stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counter while baby Rosie played in her high chair with a set of measuring spoons. Danny was in the recliner, his legs stretched out, a heating pad draped over his back. The TV was on low, showing a nature documentary, but no one was watching it. It was one of those quiet evenings that should have felt like comfort. Instead, Irene felt the stirrings of confession rise, like heat behind her eyes. "I need to tell you both something," she said softly, setting her purse down. Her voice barely rose above the hum of the refrigerator, but it made Camilla stop mid-motion. Denny turned down the volume, eyebrows raised. "Is everything okay?" Irene didn't sit. She couldn't. Not yet. "It's about the ring. My wedding ring." Camila blinked. "The one you said you lost in the garden?" Irene nodded slowly. "I didn't lose it." The silence that followed wasn't sharp, just still, like the moment before a tree creaks in the wind. "I sold it," Irene continued, her voice faltering. "Months ago. The rent was due and the fridge was nearly empty. I didn't want you to know. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want you to feel guilty. Camila's eyes filled immediately. I know it was wrong to lie, Irene said, wringing her hands. But I did it for all of you. For the kids, for the groceries. I just didn't see another way. Luis would have understood, I think. He always said the ring was just a symbol, not the love itself. Denny stood, wincing as his back straightened. You fed us. You helped us survive. Don't you ever feel bad about that? Sound came from the hallway, light footsteps on tile. It was Mateo. He must have been listening. The boy walked in slowly, his face serious, older than his years. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his head against her. You did what Grandpa would have done, Mateo whispered. And I think he'd be proud. Irene held Mateo close, burying her face in his thick hair, the scent of laundry soap and sun lingering there. Her hands trembled slightly, not from shame anymore, but from the release of holding everything in for too long. Across the room, Camila wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and crossed over. You should have told me, Mama, she whispered. We would have figured something out. You already had too much on your shoulders, Irene replied, letting go of Mateo and turning to face her daughter. Troy's surgery, the job, the bills. I didn't want to add my pain to yours, but that's what families are for, Camila said, her voice cracking. We carry each other. You didn't have to protect us from that. Irene reached for her hand. It was never about pride. It was about love. That ring. It was Luis. It was all the years we spent making something out of nothing. Giving it up. Her voice caught in her throat. Felt like cutting a piece of myself away. Camila leaned her forehead against her mother's. You never lost him. He's in everything we do. Denny walked over, more upright now, despite the brace still tucked under his shirt. You know what this sounds like to me? He said. Power, not pity. You didn't ask anyone for help. You just acted. That's what leaders do. Irene gave a dry laugh. I don't know about that. You fed 5 people with quiet sacrifice, he said. That's more than most so-called leaders ever do. Mateo looked up. Wait, are you going to take the job? Irene blinked at him. How did you? I saw the folder in your purse, he admitted sheepishly. It had Keanu Reeves' name on it. Denny raised an eyebrow. Wait, the Keanu Reeves? Irene sighed, suddenly tired but smiling. Apparently. He was the man at the garden, disguised. I had no idea who he was. You're telling me John Wick eats your tomatoes? Danny asked, half laughing. I'm telling you, Irene said, gesturing to the room, that the man from the movies wants me to lead a new project. Something about transforming vacant lots into community gardens. It comes with a salary, health care, everything. Camila sat down slowly as if grounding herself. That's incredible, Mama. Life-changing. It's terrifying, Irene admitted. I'm 74. I've never led anything larger than a church potluck. And now I'm supposed to manage teams, budgets, outreach. It's too big for me. Camila reached for her hand again. Do you think the soil asks if it's strong enough before growing something new? Irene stared at her. You've spent your life planning things, Camila said gently. Maybe this time, you're the one who's about to bloom. Irene didn't speak for a moment. The apartment had fallen quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of shame anymore. It felt like the stillness before something began, like waiting for a seed to sprout. She looked down at her hands, worn and lined from decades of work, from peeling potatoes in school kitchens to kneading dough by candlelight when the power bill couldn't be paid on time. She thought of Luis, thought of the night he gave her the ring, how his hands had trembled when he slid it onto her finger, and how hers had trembled taking it off. She'd done it to feed her family. Now they wanted her to feed an entire city. "I don't know if I can do this," she said finally. "This kind of thing, it belongs to people who went to college, who use laptops like second nature, who know how to talk big in meetings, not to someone like me." Denny sat beside her and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Irene, people like you are the reason neighborhoods survive when the city forgets them. You know how to stretch a dollar, how to build a meal from beans and broken vegetables, how to grow food in soil that gave up 10 years ago. That's leadership. And if Keanu Reeves thinks you're the right person," Camila added, "why are you the only one who does?" Irene smiled softly. "He said something like that too. I told him I'm just a grandma with a shovel." "And he said?" Mateo asked. "That's exactly who we need." The words hung in the air. They didn't sound foolish anymore. They sounded like purpose. Baby Rosie stirred in her playpen and let out a sleepy cry. Irene moved to lift her, cradling her soft body in her arms. Rosie's tiny hand curled around her necklace chain, tugging it gently. Irene kissed her forehead and looked out the window. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, the sun beginning to set over rooftops, patched in rust and satellite dishes. Camila was right. This wasn't just about gardens. It was about dignity, about reclaiming space, about making sure no mother had to sell her ring to buy milk and flour again. "I'll need help," Irene said, her voice steadier now. "You've got us," Camila replied. "All of us. And I'll teach you how to use Google Sheets," Mateo offered proudly. Irene laughed, a real laugh that shook her shoulders and echoed into the hallway. She looked at each of them in turn, her family, her roots, and felt something shift. Did not fear, readiness. "All right," she said. "Let's grow something bigger." They all gathered around her, their arms overlapping, forming a circle that felt both fragile and indestructible. Somewhere deep inside her, Irene felt the soil begin to stir. The morning Irene accepted the job, the apartment felt a little lighter, as if the air itself had been holding its breath for weeks and had finally exhaled. Camila made her a celebratory breakfast, just eggs and toast, but served it on the nice plates, the ones saved for birthdays and holidays. Rosie banged a spoon against the table, delighted by the clatter. Mateo and Lily gave her a hand-drawn "Congrats, Grandma" banner, which hung a little crooked over the living room window, but made Irene's heart swell. She wasn't sure what came next. The offer was real. The numbers on the contract were real, and the schedule of duties had already arrived in her inbox. That afternoon, she met Grace Liu again, who walked her through the onboarding process and gave her the address for the next city council meeting. Irene had expected to just show up, maybe stand at the back. Instead, she was told she'd be introduced as formally as the new director of Portland's Green Block pilot. That night, Irene lay awake long after the apartment had quieted. The job felt too big, too official. She was still just a grandma who used egg cartons for seedlings. What did she know about policy meetings and line MO budgets? Camila, half asleep across the room, muttered softly, "You're going to be amazing, Mom." "I haven't even started. You started the day you planted that first tomato. You've been doing this for years." Irene didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the window, where moonlight slid across the carpet in silver lines. She thought about Luis, how he'd stood beside her the day the community garden broke ground, shovel in hand, boots muddy, calling her jefa like she was some kind of big-shot farm boss. He'd believed in her long before she'd learned to believe in herself. The next day came quickly. She wore her best cardigan, a deep maroon one with pearl buttons she had reinforced herself, and ironed the collar 3 times just to make sure it stayed flat. Grace picked her up in a modest gray car. On the ride, they passed several of the vacant lots slated for conversion. Trash drifted in corners. Chain-link fences sagged. Irene looked at each space not as a problem, but as a The community council meeting was held in a bright room above the public library. Folding chairs lined the walls. Coffee steamed in a corner. Irene sat near the back, heart hammering, until Grace gave her a small nod. Keanu walked to the podium, dressed plainly, a blue flannel shirt and worn boots. When he spoke, it was with quiet conviction. Portland deserves food grown with dignity. So today we're not bringing in someone with a fancy degree, we're bringing in someone with hands in the soil. Someone who knows what it means to grow life from almost nothing. Then he gestured. This is Irene Martinez. She's the lead on our Green Block project. Irene stood. The room erupted in applause. But inside, all she felt was stillness. And something that might have been peace. Irene didn't remember walking to the front of the room. Her legs moved on their own, slow and steady, like they had when she used to carry heavy pots of soup down the school cafeteria line. She gave a little wave, not trusting her voice just yet. The clapping faded into a respectful quiet. Keanu stepped aside. "Would you like to say something?" he asked gently. Irene looked at the crowd. Some were city officials in neat jackets. Others were volunteers, parents, neighbors she'd seen over the years buying seeds or asking for gardening advice. She took a breath. "I'm not used to microphones," she said, her voice a little shaky. "But I know soil." A soft laugh rose from the audience. "I know what it's like to plant something and not be sure it'll grow. I know what it's like to hope, even when your pantry's empty. This garden we're talking about, it's not just vegetables. It's pride. It's learning. It's healing." Someone in the back murmured, "Amen." Irene smiled and continued. "We've got enough buildings. What we need are roots. Not just in the ground, but in each other." A stillness settled over the room, the kind that only happens when everyone feels the same thing at once. Then came the applause again. But this time, it wasn't polite. It was full. After the meeting, people approached her one by one. A teacher from the East Side asked if her students could volunteer. A grocer offered to donate extra produce. Someone from the Parks Department wanted to talk about water access. Grace handed her a folder stuffed with forms, interest lists, and community feedback. Irene felt the shift. She wasn't just a name on a page anymore. She was the anchor of something living. By the end of the week, she had visited 3 of the proposed lots. 2 were in worse shape than she'd feared. One still had rusted swings and broken glass scattered near the fence. But she could already see the raised beds in her mind, the compost pile tucked in the back corner, the laughter of children harvesting carrots with dirt still clinging to their fingers. Then, on a quiet Friday afternoon, just after she returned from a meeting at the Parks Department, a package arrived. Brown paper, hand-tied with twine, no return address, her name written in clean script. She opened it on the kitchen table, with Camila watching curiously. Inside was a simple velvet box. Irene's hands began to shake. "What is it, Mom?" Camila asked. Irene opened the lid. Nestled inside was a wedding band. Gold, slightly worn, with 3 tiny diamonds. It wasn't her original ring. She knew that the moment she touched it. But it was familiar, comforting. A message, perhaps. Underneath was a handwritten note. A symbol should not be lost even when the story changes. K. Irene pressed her hand to her chest. She slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't carry the weight of Luisa's actual band, but it held something else. A quiet promise. That night, Irene sat alone on the balcony, the city lights flickering like candles in the distance. The new rain gleamed faintly under the porch lamp, warm against her skin. She twisted it slowly, the way she used to with the original, when deep in thought or prayer. She knew it wasn't the same. That ring had gone with her through 5.5 decades of birthdays, thunderstorms, scraped knees, funerals, kisses. It had felt Luis's hand wrapped around hers, steady and sure, even in his final moments. But this one, this small circle of gold, wasn't pretending to replace what had been lost. It was honoring it. A tribute. A sign that someone, somewhere, had paid attention to a quiet woman in Portland who dug through tired soil to make something grow. Belay. Irene looked up at the stars. "I didn't expect any of this, Luis," she whispered. "But I think maybe this is still your doing." From inside, she could hear baby Rosie giggling in the arms of her mother. Life continuing. Roots taking hold. She rested her hand gently over the new ring and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because something sacred had been returned in a new form. The summer sun cast a warm glow over the once-abandoned lot that now thrived with rows of kale, tomatoes, peppers, and sprouting beans. Children ran between the planters, their laughter mixing with the hum of bees. The air smelled of fresh soil and promise. Irene stood near the entrance gate, adjusting the sun hat on her head, watching the pilot garden come to life in a way she had once only dreamed of. The transformation had taken weeks. Volunteers came from all over the city, young, old, and everything in between. Local businesses donated lumber for the planter boxes, paint for the welcome sign, and crates of compost. Irene oversaw it all. Her shovel had become a symbol. People called her Miss Irene with respect and admiration. Even the mayor stopped by for a photo during the third week and declared, "This is what Portland needs more of: community, dignity, and tomatoes as big as your fist." Every morning, Irene woke before sunrise to check on the water levels, whispering to the squash and cucumbers like old friends. Camila and Danny helped when they could, and Mateo, Lily, and baby Rosie had all planted something of their own. It wasn't just a garden, it was a rebirth. On the Friday before the official opening ceremony, Irene walked the length of the path lined with chalk-drawn butterflies and messages from neighborhood kids. She paused at the north bed, where the carrots had finally broken the surface in delicate green shoots. She smiled, then knelt to press her palm gently against the earth. Her late husband's voice echoed in her memory. Louise always used to say, "The soil remembered kindness." The next morning, a ribbon marked the entrance and folding chairs were set in neat rows. Journalists unpacked their cameras. Food trucks lined the curb. The green block pilot had drawn interest not only from city officials, but even national environmental groups. Grace Liu greeted Irene near the stage, clipboard in hand and headset askew. "He's almost here," she whispered. Irene gave a nervous smile. "I still don't know what I'm supposed to say." "Just speak from the heart," Grace said. "You always do." At exactly 10 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up beside the garden entrance. Keanu stepped out, wearing jeans, a button-down shirt, and that calm, familiar expression that seemed to put everyone at ease. A hush fell over the small crowd as he walked toward the stage. He stopped to admire the planter beds, bending to run his fingers across the hand-painted signs. "Mateo's tomatoes," read one. "Lily's lavender," another. Grace handed him a microphone as he stepped up onto the low wooden platform. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here today because one woman believed that even the smallest act of care, planting a seed, tending a garden, could change a community." Irene flushed red as he turned toward her, eyes soft with gratitude. "And now," he added, "I'd like to return something to her that should never have been lost." Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Simple, unassuming, but in his hands it carried gravity. He stepped off the stage and walked toward Irene, the crowd parting instinctively. Her breath caught. She knew, even before he opened it. Her hands trembled. Keanu stopped in front of her, holding the box out gently. "I had to be patient," he said quietly. "But some things are worth the wait." Irene looked down. Nestled inside was her wedding ring, her original ring, the one Luis had placed on her finger 55 years ago with a kiss and a trembling hand, the one she had taken off only once, when she handed it to Mr. Leon to keep her family fed. She stared, stunned. For a moment, she didn't move. "How did you?" she whispered. "I didn't," Keanu replied. "Not directly. But someone who believes in gardens and in people like you made sure it came home." With trembling fingers, she lifted the ring from the box. It was lighter than she remembered and heavier all at once. The tiny diamonds still sparkled, though the band had softened with time. But when she turned it in the sunlight, something caught her eye. Inside the band, faint but unmistakable, was an engraving she had forgotten even existed. She squinted, brought it closer, and read aloud, her voice cracking. "Love grows where you plant it," she gasped. Luis. She remembered now. How he had insisted on picking up the ring alone before their wedding. How he had refused to tell her why he'd grinned so big when he slid it onto her finger for the first time. And now, decades later, she was finally reading the secret he'd tucked inside their future. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them. Her legs buckled slightly, and Keanu gently took her elbow to steady her. She whispered again. "He always knew." The garden was silent except for the hum of wind and the soft sniffles of those watching. Someone passed Irene a tissue, and Camila came forward to wrap her mother in a hug. Mateo stood beside her, eyes wide. "Grandma?" he asked. "It's back," she choked out. "It's really back." Keanu gave her a quiet nod. Some things aren't just jewelry. They're roots. Irene slid the ring onto her finger. It still fit, perfectly, as if it had never left. Then she looked around, not just at the garden, but at the people gathered there. Neighbors, volunteers, children she didn't know but who would grow up eating from these rows. Her family, safe and smiling. And Keanu Reeves, a movie star with dirt under his nails and more heart than fame. The ring had come home. Would certainly be a massive payday. So had she. After the ceremony, Irene wandered quietly through the rows of the new garden. The scent of basil and damp soil wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. Children giggled at the butterfly trellis. A local reporter snapped photos of the tomato beds. The earth had changed, and so had she. At the edge of the lot stood a new sign, Green Block Initiative, Lead Gardener, Irene Martinez. She touched it gently. Her name, painted in careful letters, a place rooted in her hands. Keanu joined her in the shade of an old maple tree. They stood without speaking for a while. "I never thought it would go this far," Irene said softly. Keanu nodded. "But it had to start somewhere. I sold my ring, and now there's all this." She gestured to the growing space, to the families gathered with produce in their arms. "You planted more than food, Irene," Keanu replied. "You planted belief." She looked down at her ring, still shimmering beneath the dirt under her nails. "And now it's back," she said. "Full circle." Keanu smiled. "No, just getting started." The morning light stretched gently across the raised garden beds, catching on the dew-covered leaves of kale and rainbow chard. Irene stood near the edge of the plot, clipboard in hand, her silver hair tied back, and a familiar warmth rising in her chest. This patch of green in a once-abandoned lot was no longer just soil and seeds. It was a new beginning. Across the gravel path, Camilla stepped out of a delivery truck, her co-op apron slightly wrinkled, but her smile brighter than Irene had seen in years. "First delivery's in," Camilla called. "Local eggs, herbs, and tomatoes. You should see the colors." Irene walked over to meet her daughter, giving her a quick squeeze around the shoulders. "Look at you," she said, eyes shining, "running things like a boss." Camila laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm still the newest team lead, but yeah, it feels good, like I finally landed somewhere solid." "I'm proud of you," Irene said softly. The Konishwark swiveled his hands. They turned to watch as a group of children arrived with their teacher, eager to learn about compost and planting. Irene guided them toward the lesson circle under a large canvas awning, hand-painted with scenes from the neighborhood, murals that had bloomed alongside the gardens themselves. Later that afternoon, Danny arrived at the workshop trailer beside the largest garden site. He walked with a noticeable limp, but without the cane today, a small victory earned after 3 weeks of dedicated physical therapy. Under his arm, he carried a wooden crate filled with freshly sanded tools, trowels, hand rakes, and dibblers, each crafted from salvaged wood and polished to a soft finish. Irene looked up from her work when she heard him. "You're early," she said, her voice light with surprise. Danny set the crate down on a bench. "Therapist says if I keep this up, I might be able to do light carpentry full-time by the end of summer. Thought I'd get a head start." She examined the tools with gentle hands. "These are beautiful. They'll make the kids feel like real gardeners." "That's the point," Danny replied. "If they believe they're growing something, they will." A group of middle schoolers gathered around him, curious about the tools. Danny knelt carefully, showing them how each one was used and letting them feel the smooth handles. Irene stood back and watched. There was something sacred in this. Children learning from a man who thought his usefulness had ended. But in this place, even broken things had a second season. By early evening, the sky over Portland turned dusky gold and the garden lights flickered on. Tiny bulbs strung between raised beds and benches, casting a warm glow across the soil. Irene stood beneath the archway of the newest garden plot, brushing dirt from her gloves as families gathered for the weekly community dinner. Camila brought trays of roasted vegetables, and kids helped serve slices of cornbread made with garden-grown cornmeal. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, blending in with volunteers. He shook hands, shared soft smiles, and helped carry folding chairs without fuss. Most people didn't even realize who he was. And that's exactly how he liked it. When he approached Irene, he nodded toward the new sign freshly installed that morning on the side of the community building. I saw the plaque. Her eyes followed his to the copper lettering that read, "Irene Martinez Wellness Garden, for the ones who taught us to grow." "I didn't want it to be about me," Irene said softly. "It's not," Keanu replied. "It's about legacy." They stood in silence for a moment, watching kids harvest cherry tomatoes with sticky fingers. Around them, the laughter, the healing, the growth. It was all real. And it was just beginning. Irene sat at the small desk in her bedroom, the light of early morning streaming through the curtains. Her journal lay open, the pen hovering above a blank page. She tapped the pen against her chin, thinking. Then, with quiet certainty, she began to write. What started with loss turned into abundance. Those words didn't come from pride, they came from awe. It had only been a few months since she walked into that pawn shop with a trembling hand and said goodbye to the ring that had never left her finger in 55 years. Now there were children harvesting kale and basil on land that used to be covered in broken glass and bottle caps. Now, there were families coming together for seed swaps, soil workshops, and Sunday meals made from the food they had grown with their own hands. The local schools had taken notice too. At least 2 science teachers reached out, wanting to incorporate the gardens into their curriculum. On Tuesday mornings, Irene hosted groups of 5th graders who squealed with delight at earthworms and asked questions about sunlight and pH levels. She loved the curiosity in their eyes, the way they squatted next to lettuce beds and asked if plants had feelings. She always said yes, because something in her had begun to believe it. She zipped up her jacket and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the morning dew still clinging to the leaves. One of the boys who used to hang out at the corner store, always looking like trouble, was now wheeling a barrow of compost across the garden. His name was Deshaun. He'd stopped tagging fences and started building raised beds. Irene had shown him how to mix food scraps and coffee grounds, and now he was teaching other kids how to layer the pile for better nitrogen balance. When he passed her, he nodded with quiet respect. "Morning, Miss Irene." "Morning, Deshaun. Your compost looks like it's almost ready." He grinned. "2 more turns, and it'll be black gold." At the back wall of the garden, Lily was perched on a step stool, painting a mural with a borrowed set of brushes. Camila had found a non-profit that donated the supplies. The wall had once been gray and cracked, but now it bloomed with color. Vines curling around painted bricks, sunflowers rising into blue sky, and in the center, bold pink letters that said, "Love grows here." Irene pressed a hand over her heart. She couldn't help it. As Lily dipped her brush into bright yellow paint, Irene moved closer to watch. The little girl hummed to herself, her hair tied in a messy bun, and her sneakers streaked with chalk and soil. "That's the sun," Lily explained, pointing to a swirl above the words she had already painted. "Because everything needs light to grow, even people." Irene blinked fast, her throat catching. "You're right, mi amor, especially people." Behind them, Danny was setting up a new compost bin with a group of teenagers. His legs still gave him trouble, but he moved with a quiet determination, one hand gripping a cane and the other guiding the younger boys with steady confidence. Since starting physical therapy, he had come back to life, not just in body, but in spirit. He used scrap wood and donated hinges to build garden boxes, benches, and even a trellis for the beans that would grow come summer. Camila was nearby too, discussing bulk produce deliveries with a local co-op leader. She wore a green apron now, proudly embroidered with the logo of the food cooperative where she had just been promoted to community outreach coordinator. The job wasn't just a paycheck, it was purpose. She often joked that Irene had passed her love for feeding people down the line, like a recipe handed from mother to daughter. "I'll be home late tonight," Camilla called out, waving at Irene as she closed her clipboard. "We're planning the harvest dinner with the elementary school." Irene nodded, her heart full. "I'll save you a bowl of soup." Just beyond the tool shed, a quiet figure stood at the edge of the garden, near the gate. He wore a flannel shirt, jeans, and a worn baseball cap pulled low. Most wouldn't have noticed him. He made no sound, took no photos, didn't speak to anyone. But Irene saw him. Keanu. He had a way of showing up like that, without fanfare or cameras. Just to see. Just to feel. Sometimes he helped load wheelbarrows or refill the water barrels. Sometimes he sat on the bench under the old oak tree, quietly observing. Today, he watched Lily paint the last curve of a red heart beside her son, and then he turned to go, unnoticed by everyone but Irene. She said nothing. She simply placed her hand on her chest where her ring now lived again. And in that quiet moment, something passed between them. Gratitude, respect, and the kind of understanding that needed no words. That evening, Irene sat on the back steps of the community center, a bowl of black bean soup cradled in her lap. The garden lay quiet now, kissed by the orange hue of twilight. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, and the scent of tomato vines clung gently to the air. From a distance, the mural shimmered faintly. Lily's yellow sun, the bold red heart, and the sweeping letters, "Love grows here." She opened her journal and flipped to a fresh page. Her hands, weathered and firm, held the pen with steady grace. What began with a sacrifice turned into a harvest I never expected. I planted hope where I thought there was only grief. And now, every child's laugh in the garden, every hand reaching into the soil, every bite of something we grew, feels like a hymn to Luis. She paused, glancing at her wedding ring. It glinted gently under the fading sun. There was comfort in its weight, but also in what had come from giving it up. You always said I could grow anything, mi amor, but I never knew I could help grow a future. From inside the center came the muffled sounds of Camilla reading to Rosie, her voice soft and warm. Mateo was at the kitchen table helping Lily with homework. Danny was washing dishes, his voice low as he hummed the old ranchera tunes he used to play on his guitar before the accident. The family had been rebuilt, not by chance, but by planting seeds, small ones, hidden ones, seeds of sacrifice, of trust, of community. Irene closed her journal and looked up at the stars beginning to appear. One by one, they blinked into view. Quiet, constant reminders of things that endure, even when unseen. She didn't hear Keanu's footsteps as he returned that night, but she felt his presence again, this time leaving a small envelope at the foot of the mural before slipping back into the shadows. Inside the envelope, which she'd discovered the next morning, was a photograph of her garden taken from above by drone. Slush, vibrant, full of life. Along with it, a handwritten note. Stillness can change a city. And quiet gardener just did. And beneath that, one final line. Let's keep planting. Irene folded the note and tucked it between the pages of her journal, where it would rest next to her own words. A symbol, a spark, a silent vow. The garden wasn't just soil and seeds anymore. It was a movement. It was memory. It was love, still growing. The sun rose gently over Irene's Portland neighborhood, casting soft golden light over the garden beds that lined the back fence. The air was crisp, the sky clear. Irene Martinez, now 75, stood in front of her modest closet in a neat blouse and navy slacks. In her hand, she held a folded letter. An invitation from a Sacramento City councilwoman to speak at a regional summit on food insecurity. She had almost declined. Who was she, after all? Just a grandmother. A widow. A former school lunch cook with tired knees and no fancy degrees. But Camilla had insisted. Danny had nodded with pride. And Camilla, quiet, steady, had sent a message through Grace Lou that simply read, "Speak the truth, only you can. We'll be listening." Now, as Irene looked into the mirror and brushed a few silver strands into place, her heart beat steadily, not with nerves, but with something else. Readiness. In the living room, Mateo was taping a small note into her travel bag. "Grandma, we love you more than tomatoes." She smiled and blinked fast. An electric vehicle waited outside. The driver, young and respectful, opened the door and greeted her like a diplomat. She laughed softly, clutching her worn handbag that held her notes. "You're about to take a grandma to the capital," she said. The road to Sacramento felt longer than the distance. As farms, towns, and freeways rolled by, Irene kept glancing at the small notebook in her lap. She had written out what she wanted to say, but deep down, she knew her words had to come from the soil of her life. She thought of Luis. She thought of selling her wedding ring. She thought of Rosie's tiny hand in hers when they planted seeds together for the first time. At the summit hall, the energy was palpable. Lawmakers, educators, nonprofit leaders, food advocates. Her name was printed on a laminated badge she wore around her neck. Irene Martinez, Green Block Director. It still looked strange. Keanu wasn't there in person, but as she entered the green room, Grace Lou handed her a note with only 4 words in his familiar handwriting: "Let love be loud." When her name was called, Irene stepped up to the podium under bright lights. The room hushed. "I'm not here because I have a solution," she began. "I'm here because I had a problem. One you may have seen on your own streets. I'm here because I once sold my wedding ring to buy groceries for my family." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She held up her hand, now wearing the same ring, its gold warm with memory. "But I didn't lose love when I did that. I planted it." The room was silent. Then the first pair of hands began to clap, then another, until everyone was on their feet. A standing ovation that lasted almost a minute. And in the back row, a quiet figure in a dark baseball cap dipped his head with a smile. After the applause faded and the session concluded, Irene stepped away from the podium and back into the hallway, dazed but upright. Staffers approached her with handshakes and gratitude. A reporter from a California public radio station asked if she had a few minutes. Irene politely declined. Her knees ached, and her thoughts still swirled like wind in the bean rows back home. In a quiet lounge behind the auditorium, Grace Liu met her with a cup of tea. "You moved the room," Grace said gently. Even the mayor's chief of staff wiped a tear. "I'm not used to being heard," Irene replied, her voice still steady. "It's strange." Grace smiled. "Maybe it's time you got used to it." They sat together for a moment in silence. Irene looked down at her ring, Luis's ring. The tiny inscription inside still felt like a secret kept by time. "Love grows where you plant it." It wasn't just a saying now. It was proof. She had sold the ring to keep love alive, and love had returned to her, richer than ever. Later that evening, she attended a quiet reception hosted by the city council. She stayed near the corner of the room, sipping water, answering kind questions, and smiling graciously. Most people didn't recognize her until a councilwoman loudly declared, "That's her! That's Irene!" The ring lady. The nickname made her laugh out loud. People from nonprofits, schools, and even a tech firm asked about replicating the Green Block initiative in their cities. Could she advise? Would she join a panel? Could they fly out to Portland and see the gardens? "I'm not sure I'm the expert," Irene said repeatedly. But her phone lit up with contacts and meeting requests nonetheless. As she rode back to her hotel, the streets of Sacramento passing softly in the window, Irene pulled out her notebook again. She wrote slowly, February 14. "I spoke today with my hands still smelling faintly of compost and rosemary. I told the truth. I told our story. I think they heard it." When she got to her hotel room, she sat quietly on the bed. The city outside buzzed faintly, but the room was still. Irene turned off the TV, turned off her phone, and simply sat with her hands in her lap, eyes closed. The next morning, she woke early. The driver waited promptly at 7 a.m., and she made her way back to Portland. As they passed through the farmland just outside the city, Irene leaned closer to the window. There, in a sun-warmed stretch of valley, workers were kneeling in a row, planting something green. She touched her ring with her thumb. Planting was hope, and hope, she now knew, could go further than anyone believed, especially when it started in a garden and was watered by love. When Irene returned to Portland that afternoon, the sky was overcast, but the welcome was warm. Camila met her at the door with a tight hug, and Danny stood behind her, cane in hand, grinning. On the living room table was a handmade sign from Lily. "Welcome home, Sacramento Star," decorated with marker vines and glittery beans. Mateo handed her a newspaper. On the front page was her photo at the podium, eyes closed, hand on her heart, captioned, "From Ring to Roots, Grandmother's Words Stir a Nation." "I think you're famous now, Grandma," he said. Irene chuckled and kissed his forehead. "Only if they spell my name right." That night, the family gathered in the garden under string lights and shared soup made from their own vegetables. Neighbors dropped by with pie and congratulations. The laughter was soft, real. Later, as Irene stood beneath the mural Lily had painted, "Love Grows Here," Keanu appeared quietly at the gate. He didn't speak, just tipped his head and smiled. Irene walked to him and extended a hand. "Stay for dinner?" Keanu nodded. "If there's garlic bread," she laughed. "There's always garlic bread." And under that painted sky, they sat at the table together, where the seed of love had truly changed everything. The morning sun peeked gently over the rooftops of northeast Portland, casting golden light over the small but flourishing garden in the backyard. Irene Martinez sat quietly on the wooden porch swing, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with strong coffee and a dash of cinnamon. Her wedding ring, the very one she had once let go, caught the light as she lifted the mug to her lips. It shimmered faintly, a circle of gold that had somehow traveled farther than she had ever imagined and found its way home again. The garden she had planted in memory of Luis was now alive in every way. Rows of kale shimmered with dew, cherry tomatoes burst red and full on their vines, mint spilled over the edges of a raised wooden bed, and a hand-painted sign staked in the middle read, "Luis's Garden. Love grows here." Camilla's laughter echoed from the open back door as she cleaned the kitchen with music playing low in the background. Inside, Mateo strummed his guitar softly, tuning the strings with the care of someone who had recently discovered the joy of his own rhythm. Rosie toddled barefoot in the grass, giggling at a butterfly that danced around her. The air smelled of lavender, coffee, and wet soil. It felt like life had finally caught its breath. A white envelope peeked out from the corner of the mailbox, nailed beside the porch swing. Irene hadn't seen the mail carrier come by. She reached for it, her fingers brushing over her name written in neat block letters. There was no return address, but she didn't need one. Inside was a folded piece of heavy paper. A single sentence was printed in familiar handwriting. "The garden keeps growing." Irene's throat tightened. She pressed the note against her chest and exhaled slowly. Keanu never asked for thanks, never made speeches. He just showed up when people needed something that could never be asked for out loud. A chance, a second wind, soil where roots could take hold again. She opened her journal, the same one she'd been writing in since that long, uncertain spring. Flipping to the last page, she pressed pen to paper and wrote her final entry with steady hands. Love doesn't end. It roots. It blooms. She closed the journal gently and set it beside her coffee. Then she watched Rosie chase that butterfly a little farther into the garden, Mateo's melody growing stronger behind her, and Camilla's voice rising in a soft, happy hum. The porch swing creaked as she leaned back, the gold ring warm on her finger, and a breeze lifted through the garden, carrying the scent of basil and memory. The breeze rustled the leaves just enough to stir the wind chimes, setting them into a gentle song that drifted through the yard. Irene closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. Each note felt like a whisper from the past. Luis's laugh on a warm afternoon, the quiet prayer she used to say before every meal, the hush of the soil welcoming a new seed. It was all there. Not lost, just transformed. She thought back to the beginning. That morning she had slipped off the ring, her fingers trembling, her heart pulled in two. The need was so sharp then, so raw. Groceries, diapers, a few dollars more for rent. She had told herself it was just a thing, just metal. But now she knew better. It had always been more. A symbol, a vow, a memory wrapped around her finger. Still, letting go had made room for something else. Hope had returned like spring after a long, bitter winter. It had taken root not just in the garden beds, but in her daughter's spirit, in her grandchildren's joy, in the neighbors who stopped by to drop off compost or ask for tomato seeds, in the young men who now built benches where they once broke things. The neighborhood had changed, but more than that, so had she. She stood up, slow but steady, and walked barefoot through the soft, tilled earth. Her toes sank into the ground as she passed rows of lettuce, marigolds, and onions, smiling at the handprints Rosie had made in the concrete path last week. Life marked things in small ways. The garden didn't look like much to someone speeding by, but it was everything. A sanctuary, a second chance, Proof that sometimes, when the world offers nothing, you plant anyway. She reached the back fence, where a wooden sign had recently been mounted by the local Carpenters Guild. Luis's name, carved in bold, careful letters. The Irene Martinez Wellness Garden. Irene ran her hand over the smooth grain, her voice quiet but clear. "We did it, love." Behind her, Mateo's guitar strummed a hopeful new tune. Camila stepped out onto the porch with another mug of coffee, calling out with a smile, "You better come back before it gets cold again." Irene turned, heart full, steps light. Somewhere deep inside her soul, she knew this wasn't the end, just another beginning. Here is part 3 of section 16, Final Reflection plus CTA. Word count 499. Back inside, Irene sat down at her kitchen table and opened her journal. It was the last page. Her handwriting had become steadier over the months, not because the tremble in her fingers had faded, but because the doubt had. She no longer questioned whether her story mattered. She had seen the faces in the garden. She had read the letters from strangers across the country. She had felt love ripple out from the place where loss had once taken root. She picked up her pen and wrote slowly, carefully, so that every word would remain long after she was gone. Love doesn't end. It roots. It blooms. She capped the pen, closed the journal, and pressed her hand over it for a long moment. A soft knock on the door broke the stillness. Camila stepped in, holding a letter. "It's from him," she said, handing it over gently. Irene opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of thick paper. There was no formal header, no signature needed, just one sentence, handwritten in black ink. "The garden keeps growing." Irene smiled, tears brimming again. She placed the letter inside the journal where it belonged, a seed of its own. Outside, Rosie was running barefoot through the grass. Mateo played the melody he had written for her birthday. Camila laughed from the porch as she filled pots with herbs for the kitchen. And the ring, her real ring, glinted in the sunlight, just as it had the day Luis first slid it onto her finger. Irene breathed in the moment, holding it close. It wasn't perfect, but it was full, and it was hers. Have you ever given up something precious for someone you love? Tell us your story in the comments. And what should Keanu do next to help more families? Subscribe to keep the kindness growing.